She was born into privilege, raised in a world of silk, steel, and superstition, a child of noble blood, born under a family crest soaked in both power and violence. Her lands stretched across Hungary and Transylvania. Her family commanded armies and whispered in the ears of kings. She was meant to be a wife, a countess, a mother. But history remembers her as something else. They call her the Blood Countess, a woman who, according to legend, bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. A woman said to have tortured and killed hundreds, perhaps over 600, young girls. A woman who, in her final years, was locked inside her castle and bricked into a single room, living in the darkness with nothing but her screams. But who was Erzsébet BáthoryThe really? Was she truly the most prolific female murderer in recorded history? Or was she a victim of a political conspiracy, an inconvenient widow with too much land and too much power in the hands of the wrong religion? This is not the version of the story you've heard before. This is the history that survived the fire. This is the case they buried under myth, shame, and blood. To understand Erzsébet BáthoryThe, we must begin long before the killings. She was born in 1560 into the house of Báthory, one of the most powerful families in Eastern Europe. Her uncle was the voivode of Transylvania. Her cousin would later become the king of Poland. The Báthorys were wealthy, well-educated, and feared. They were also plagued by rumors, mental illness, sadism, pagan rituals passed down like heirlooms. From an early age, Erzsébet showed signs of brilliance. She was fluent in Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. She could quote Cicero. She studied astronomy, philosophy, and statecraft. But she also suffered from intense seizures, violent outbursts, and long periods of reclusion. Some historians believe she may have had epilepsy. Others suspect bipolar disorder or undiagnosed trauma. At the age of 11, she was engaged to Ferencz Nundásti, a rising military noble. He was 5 years older, brutal on the battlefield, and soon to become one of the most feared generals in Europe. Their marriage was arranged, not for love, but for consolidation of power. Ferenc was Protestant. Erzsébet was raised Calvinist in a Catholic-leaning empire. The union was a political gamble, and one that would prove fatal. At 15, Erzsébet became a wife. At 17, she gave birth to her first child, and then Ferenc left for war. While he campaigned across Ottoman front lines, Erzsébet remained at Castle Zu Actis, overseeing vast estates, finances, and hundreds of servants. She ruled like a man, commanded with letters sealed in her own hand, and issued punishments without consultation. For a woman in 16th century Europe, her autonomy was not just rare, it was dangerous. Ferenc, meanwhile, had earned a reputation for cruelty. He impaled Turkish prisoners. He sewed victims into the bellies of dead horses. It was said he once gifted Erzsébet a glove lined with iron claws to discipline disobedient maids. And Erzsébet, whether by influence or instinct, learned how power could be enforced through pain. By the time Ferenc returned from war, he was dying. Some said poisoned, others claimed syphilis. In 1604, he collapsed and never walked again. He died 2 years later, leaving Erzsébet a widow at the age of 44. With his death, all authority over the BáthoryThe estates passed to her. That's when the rumors began. At first, they were whispers. A girl had gone missing. A servant was found beaten to death. A chambermaid had vanished after spilling wine on Erzsébet's dress. The local clergy inquired, but Erzsébet was untouchable. Then more stories surfaced. One told of a girl who had needles pushed under her fingernails, then her lips sewn shut for screaming. Another claimed Erzsébet bit chunks of flesh from a maid's shoulder and forced her to eat them. Others swore they heard women being flogged with stinging nettles, burned with red, hot coins, or stripped naked and dragged through snow until their skins split open. Still, no charges came, because these were peasant girls, because they worked in the castle, because no one dared cross a woman with that much wealth and that many soldiers. Then came the deaths in the village, daughters sent to sue, actors to learn courtly manners, never returned. Erzsébet had begun recruiting from minor noble families. She opened a finishing school for girls of good breeding. She promised refinement, education, marriage prospects. Instead, they were said to be tortured, mutilated, drained of blood. This time, their parents noticed. In 1610, King Matthias II, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, finally authorized an investigation, not out of morality, but because Erzsébet owed him a vast debt, and her execution would mean the crown could claim her lands. He appointed Jew Rogi Thurzy, Palatine of Hungary, to lead the inquiry. Thurzy was a distant relative, a devout Catholic, and a man with ambitions of his own. What Thurzy uncovered, or claimed to uncover, would echo through history. Over the next months, his agents interviewed more than 300 witnesses: servants, villagers, priests, castle guards. Many repeated what they'd heard. A few claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. Some spoke of rooms lined with chains and cages. Others described a notebook where Erzsébet recorded the names of every girl she had killed. Over 600. No such notebook was ever found. But Thurzy didn't wait for proof. On the night of December 30th, 1610, he stormed Castle Zu Actus with a small army. What he found became legend. 4 dead girls, 1 dying, another bleeding from open wounds, chained to a pillar. In Erzsébet's private chamber, blood-stained instruments, ropes and iron restraints. She was placed under house arrest, not tried, not tortured, not executed, because she was nobility. Her accomplices, 4 servants, were not so lucky. They were interrogated, mutilated, burned alive. Erzsébet was sealed inside a bricked room within her castle. A single slit allowed for food and air. She lived like that for 4 years, and then in 1614 she was found dead on the floor, cold, stiff, and silent. The official cause was unknown. No autopsy, no public funeral. Her body was said to be buried in the church at Zu Actus, but later moved in secret after locals vandalized her grave. What remained was the myth, a woman so obsessed with beauty that she bathed in blood, a noble predator who preyed on the weak, a monster in silk hiding behind manners and Latin phrases. But even today, the question haunts historians. Was Erzsébet BáthoryThe truly a mass murderer? Or was she a powerful widow brought down by a system that feared women with too much agency? They say she kept a list, 650 names, each girl numbered, catalogued, remembered. They say the list was found hidden in her chamber, written in her own elegant Latin script. But no such list has ever been produced. No photograph, no transcription, no record in the royal archives. And yet, for 4 centuries, that invisible ledger has haunted Erzsébet BáthoryThe's legacy more than any corpse ever could. It was Erzsébet, the Palatine of Hungary, who first mentioned the list. In a letter to the emperor, he wrote that one of her servants had confessed to helping count the victims, one by one, as the lady scribbled them down. But the servant in question, Dorothea Sentitz, was tortured before she spoke. Her fingers were broken, her feet scorched, her genitals burned with hot irons. She confessed to everything. She said she helped bury bodies beneath the stables. She said she rubbed blood onto Erzsébet's face like perfume. She said the countess would scream in ecstasy when the blood hit her skin. But if you ask a historian what these confessions mean, you get a different answer. Under torture, the body wants only one thing: for the pain to stop. And when the interrogator wants a story, the victim learns to give it. By the time Erzsébet was arrested, rumors had turned into gospel. Testimony came in floods. Some claimed they'd seen her drink blood from a silver cup. Others said they saw girls being strangled with silk ribbons, bitten to death, burned with heated iron stars. But not a single eyewitness described the countess doing it herself. Always it was the servants. Always it was hearsay. A girl saw a wound, a maid heard screams, a priest smelled blood. No trial was ever held, no forensic evidence recorded. Not a single body was exhumed. And perhaps most curious of all, no noble family whose daughter had vanished ever brought formal charges. If Erzsébet truly murdered hundreds of aristocratic girls, where were the outraged fathers? The duels, the letters to the king. Silence, because the only girls who disappeared were peasants, the poor, the forgotten. Or perhaps, just perhaps, they never existed at all. It's here that the story begins to fracture. The deeper you dig, the more the blood turns to shadow. In 1611, just months after Erzsébet's arrest, King Matthias II forgave a large portion of her debt. Debts she had inherited from her husband, Ferenc. The condition? Her lands would be placed under imperial control. Thirza, her so-called jailer, quietly acquired several of those properties through marriage and grants. The Báthory family, once a pillar of Protestant influence in a Catholic empire, collapsed within a generation. And Erzsébet herself, the richest widow in Central Europe, became a ghost, erased without trial, without tombstone, locked away in her own home like a shameful secret. When viewed through that lens, the case begins to look less like a criminal proceeding and more like a coup. There's precedent for it in the same century across Europe. Powerful women were being crushed beneath the weight of fabricated morality. In Buburisberg, Germany, a series of witch trials from 1625 to 1630 executed over 900 people, many of them women who owned land or ran businesses. In England, Lady Alice Kyteler, a wealthy innkeeper, was accused of sorcery in 1324. Her crime: lending money and refusing to remarry after her husband died. In France, midwives were arrested en masse under suspicion of child sacrifice because they knew too much about life and death. The world Erzsébet lived in was one where women who stepped outside their roles were quickly redefined as monsters. Too sexual, a temptress; too rich, a thief; too powerful, a witch; or worse, a murderer. The horror of Erzsébet's story lies not only in the crimes alleged, but in the machinery that made those crimes believable. The pamphlets published in Vienna and Nuremberg painted her as a vampire. They used woodcut illustrations, wild-eyed, blood-drenched, whipping girls tied to beds. None of the artists had ever seen her, but the image stuck. A pale woman draped in lace, crimson on her lips, sipping youth from open wounds. It sold copies. It terrified the masses, and it made sure that whatever happened at Zoo Actus Castle, no one would ever question the outcome. But questions remain. How could Erzsébet have killed hundreds without anyone noticing sooner? Where were the graves? Why were the investigators allowed to seize property after her arrest? And why, for all her alleged depravity, was she never formally tried? There is one possible answer, one more terrifying than the legend itself. What if she was guilty, not of bloodbaths, not of vampirism, but of cruelty unchecked and unaccountable? What if Erzsébet BáthoryThe was a noble woman who, like many of her class, abused her servants behind closed doors and was simply allowed to do so until it became politically convenient to stop her? What if the real crime was not the violence itself, but that it became embarrassing, that it crossed from the private into the public, that it threatened the illusion of control? In 17th century Europe, peasants were not people. They were property. Hurting them was not a crime, but embarrassing the crown, that required justice. And so the horror was not invented, but exaggerated, exploited, transformed from whispers into theater. A noblewoman killing a few servants became a vampire killing 600 girls, because monsters are easier to condemn than nobles. Because vampires don't need trials, they just need a good story. In the end, the woman in the bricked room said nothing. For 4 years, she sat in the dark, no visitors, no voice, until one morning in 1614, a guard opened the slit and found her cold, rigid, and silent. Some said she died of a seizure. Others whispered poison. Some claimed she went mad, clawed at the walls, and choked on her own hair. No one knows, and that, perhaps, is the most fitting end for a woman who was once one of the most powerful figures in Europe and died as a myth told in blood. Centuries later, the stories remain. Tourists still walk the ruins of Zoo Actus Castle. They take selfies against mossy stone, peer into the cellar where screams once echoed. If they ever did, they buy postcards, sip wine labeled blood of the Countess? And ask the same questions whispered by terrified villagers 400 years ago. Did she really bathe in blood? Did she really kill 600 girls? Was she a vampire? But the deeper you look, the more the legend reveals its seams. The bath of blood, first mentioned not in court records, but in a book published more than 100 years after her death. The 600 victims, based on a notebook no one has ever seen. The torture chambers, described only by men who stood to gain from her downfall, and the bloodline, conveniently erased, leaving no hair to challenge those who profited. What Erzsébet BáthoryThe became was something larger than truth. She became a vessel for male fear of powerful women, for church resentment of aristocratic Protestants, for a monarchy desperate to regain control over lands held too long by the same family, for folklore's need for monsters, and for history's need for certainty. But history rarely offers certainty. It offers layers, versions. There is the Erzsébet of the courts, the wealthy widow who ruled her estates with an iron will. There is the Erzsébet of the villagers, the strange noblewoman whose servants vanished without explanation. There is the Erzsébet of the church, a deviant, a heretic, a threat to God and king. And there is the Erzsébet of our nightmares, the Blood Countess, lips red with innocence, laughing as the young scream in chains. Perhaps the most chilling truth is this: all of them could be real, because history doesn't require a single version to be true, only that enough people believed it at the right time. What happened to Erzsébet BáthoryThe is what happens to all people caught between myth and power. She became useful, useful as a warning, useful as a monster, useful as a sacrifice. They took a woman, flawed, fierce human, and turned her into an archetype, and we accepted it because the story worked, because we'd rather believe in vampires than injustice, because it's easier to condemn cruelty when it wears fangs and a gown than when it wears a crown and calls itself justice. And so the question isn't whether Erzsébet BáthoryThe was guilty. It's why her story has survived so long, why it still sells books, why her name still haunts history like a stain that won't wash away. The truth is, we keep Erzsébet BáthoryThe alive because we need her. We need her to remind us what unchecked power can do behind closed doors. We need her to satisfy our hunger for horror dressed in lace. And we need her to ask the question we're too afraid to answer. If the Countess was innocent, what does that say about us? Because it wasn't the blood that made her story immortal. It was the silence of the peasants who disappeared, the silence of the court that refused a trial, the silence of the walls that bricked her in, and our silence centuries later as we keep repeating the same story, never wondering who wrote it in the first place. She died alone, her name erased from family registers, her grave lost or hidden. But her legend never needed a body, only a woman with too much power, and a world desperate to see her bleed.